Hi, I'm Jim Cuno, President and Director of the Art Institute of Chicago. It's my very great pleasure to have with me this afternoon Neil MacGregor, Director of the British Museum. Neil is with us to speak this evening as part of a program we've developed in collaboration with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and the Poetry Foundation, called 360 Degrees, Art Beyond Borders, looking at how the arts of humankind have created relationships between cultures and have crossed borders to make connections otherwise unforeseen. Now, Neil MacGregor, as Director of the British Museum, is Director of the first great encyclopedic museum. Neil, can you tell us about the origins of the British Museum?
Yes, the British Museum is set up in London in 1753, at the moment when London is trading with the whole world. And because of the shipping strength of Britain at the time, London is the first place where you can really bring together under one roof objects from all over the world. And so Parliament decides that in order for people to understand the world, they should look at the things made all over the world, gather them together in the centre of London and open them free to the citizens. So in a way, what the British Museum is about is an attempt to create a new kind of citizen, a citizen that will be a citizen of the whole world and able to compare what happens in one place with what happens in another, and above all to see how connected the world is.
And I remember that you said that it is in London. It could have been elsewhere by the terms of the original donation, but that it was in London because it met the terms of the donor.
Yes, the donor was a very remarkable man called Hans Sloane, who was a doctor who was very interested in being able to compare how different cultures did the same kinds of things. So he collects, for instance, shoes from all over the world to show that everybody wears shoes, everybody needs shoes, but the kind of shoes you have will depend on the kind of climate, the kind of animals, whatever. And what he wanted to come out of that was that you would realize that it's exactly the same with the way you organize your society, your religions, whatever, that everybody does the same kind of thing, but just does it in different ways. So he put together this extraordinary collection of things from all over the world. And it was open in his house, free for study, and he wanted it to be kept together forever and made available free to anybody. And on those terms he offered it first to the Parliament in London, but if London didn't want to buy it, it was to be offered in turn to St. Petersburg, to Berlin, to Paris and to Madrid. So there was no notion at all that this was a national collection. It's never been a national collection. It was always a collection of the whole world that he wanted the whole world to study.
And at the time, London was, if not the largest, one of the very largest, most global cities. And that's also true today. And so those terms are still the driving terms of the programs of the British Museum. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. London was at that stage the biggest and the most cosmopolitan city in Europe. It still is. But it's now cosmopolitan in a different way. One of the extraordinary things, of course, that's changed is in the 18th century, when a world collection was presented in London, it was presented essentially to other Europeans. Now, because of the enormous migrations over the centuries, but particularly in the last 2 generations, London is a city that has got a world population. We reckon that there are about 300 mother tongues spoken in London. There are huge African, Asian populations in London. So the world collection is now being visited by a world public. And therefore, I think a world collection has got to become something else. It's got a different role now.
And in the founding of the British Museum and the subsequent couple of centuries, let's say, emphasis was on bringing together things in London to be seen by the increasingly diverse population of London and all of those who visited London. But I know now, in the most recent decade or so, that under your leadership, the British Museum has also been looking out and taking expertise and resources and collections to collaborate with people living elsewhere in the world.
I think this is one of the great changes again of the last generation for our kind of museum, that until, let's say, 1970, essentially things had to be in one place. You could only have one thing in one place. It wasn't safe for them to travel. It was very difficult, very expensive. Because of the enormous advances in technology of travel, conservation, and because of the cheapness of travel, it's now perfectly possible to lend the collection regularly around the world. So you can think of a great museum's collection now, in a sense, as a kind of lending library from which the world can draw. I think that's very, very important for our kind of museum in the new world that we now live in, because it was meant to be seen and studied by the whole world. That's what was intended. In the 18th century, you could only do that by putting it in a big city, making it free. You can now do it by sending parts of the collection around the world. And at the moment, the British Museum is visited in London by about 5 million people every year. But the collections are seen by about another 2 or 3 million around the world. And I think that is one of the big challenges for encyclopedic collections, is to let the rest of the world use them and see them.
What about the challenge that is often put to those of us who express the values of the Encyclopedic Museum, as you have done so well, but the challenge is put to us by people who say that, well, that's all very good, but that's a rationalization. The Encyclopedic Museum is really the result and the consequence of imperialism.
No, the Encyclopedic Museum is an aspect of the engagement with the whole world by essentially European societies from the 16th century on. Another aspect of that is imperialism, of course. And the two have gone, in many ways, they have occurred at the same time. But they've always been about something different. The museums were always about understanding and comparing and making knowledge, and through knowledge generating tolerance. The imperial venture, the commercial ventures were, of course, different. And I think that mission of the museums, that aim of the museums, to make knowledge deeper and to share it, is something that has survived the imperial period. And that's why the sharing of the collections now is the important point. It's not, I think, the question is not to divide the collections and separate them. It's to make them as a unit shareable and usable by everybody.
You've talked about how the museums with which you're working elsewhere in the world are developing their collections and the presentation of their collections to tell a story about their local history, but in the context increasingly of its relationships to the world.
Yes, I think one of the really crucial things is that most national museums outside Europe and America are museums only of the culture of that country. And this means that if you take, for instance, China, most people in China will almost literally never have seen anything not made in China. And in their museums, they will see only Chinese material. Now, as China wants to engage with the rest of the world, wants to understand the rest of the world, the authorities in China, the museums in China, the colleagues in China have asked us to send exhibitions there of other cultures, but also of world culture and showing the overall stories of the world. I think that's what's so interesting, that it's crucial for countries, for everybody, to think now about how they take their place in the whole world story. And the big collections, the big encyclopedic collections, are a very, very important tool, I think, for everybody in that. So what we've been trying to do at the British Museum is to work with certainly museums in China, but also museums in Africa, for instance in Nairobi, where the Nairobi Museum borrows from the British Museum what it needs to locate Kenyan culture in the wider context of its neighbours, its trading patterns, its religious connections. And that role, I think, is a key one for the future.
So we're very grateful that you are here. We at the Art Institute of Chicago are committed to the prospect and the promise of the Encyclopedic Museum, and the British Museum is the model for us, as it is for all encyclopedic museums. So we're very grateful to you for giving us more of your time and more of your thoughts and ideas on the Encyclopedic Museum.
Thank you for inviting me.